We're about 200 miles from Alice Springs and heading into the red heart of Australia. It's a region known as Utopia, the poorest place in Australia. It's the home of the first Australians.
Mr. Pilger, you've made other films on the plight of Indigenous Australians. Welcome to Australia, the secret country. What prompted you to make Utopia?
Well, because it's a neglected subject. It's a subject that in Australia is people would rather not talk about, rather not examine, rather not come to terms with. It's the great open secret of Australia, both the uniqueness of the Indigenous people of this country and also the mistreatment of them. It's quite an extraordinary mistreatment when you think that Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, that people are going without basic services, that the children are suffering diseases that have long been overcome in this society. So it was a subject really that I needed to return to.
Kia ora. It's strange because so many Indigenous New Zealanders, so many Māori leave our shores every year for Australia. To us, it's the land of milk and honey. It seems bizarre that Australia can provide a much higher quality of life for so many of our Indigenous people, and yet your own Indigenous people are living in third world conditions. Why?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a different level of acceptance. Now, I must preface those remarks by saying that I am fully aware of the very considerable problems and discrimination in New Zealand against Maori people, against Indigenous people, unresolved problems. But there have been achievements by Maori people. There has been progress, however slight in some areas, but there certainly has been. And there has been, if you like, treaty agreements. In Australia, there has been none of that, and that's why Maori people can come over here from a different level, as I say, of acceptance, perhaps even a different level of prosperity, and come over here and be among the many New Zealanders that live in Australia, perhaps themselves unaware of the mistreatment and deprivation and isolation in terms of the society of Indigenous people in Australia. You're quite right to mention it. It is an irony.
You refer to it as an open secret. Do you think most Australians are aware that a third of Aborigines are dying before the age of 35, or do they just not care?
Both. They are unaware. I think if you say, I sometimes, in interviews like this, say to people, are you aware that in country towns in Western New South Wales, the life expectancy for men is in the 30s. They don't get past 30-something. Then they're shocked. Of course, that's terrible. But there is also a complementary indifference. And this comes about because there is a political indifference. More than an indifference, there's almost a political hostility in Australia at government level, especially federal government level, to dealing with Indigenous people as equals and accepting the fact that this country was never ceded to the colonists who came in the late 18th century. So, in other words, accepting that the history is wrong. In one sense, it's very right, but the history as it is believed in this country by the majority is simply wrong. And to right that wrong, it means sitting down with indigenous people. That is not acceptable to the political elite in this country. And so there's a hostility. It quite bemuses foreigners who come to Australia and get a sense of this almost contemptuous attitude towards indigenous people.
Is there much of a difference between contemporary Australia and apartheid South Africa? And if not, why isn't the rest of the world as appalled as they should be?
Well, the rest of the world is appalled when they find out. I mean, when my film Utopia was shown in the UK, I mean, one of the reactions was shock. The popular image of Australia was a pretty benign place. So what is all this about? So there was a reaction. It was shock, and yes, the comparisons are right to draw. Of course, they're very different, but they're not different in one sense. And that also brings in New Zealand. I mean, these are all colonial societies, and something very similar happens to indigenous people in colonial societies, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Latin America or whether it's in Australia or South Africa. They have to fight for survival. There is a kind of massive assault on them. I mean, comparing it with South Africa, just the number of young Aboriginal people in Australia who are incarcerated is much greater than the number of black South Africans who were incarcerated in the last 10 years of apartheid in South Africa, much greater, 7-8 times greater. So the similarities are there, and the attitudes are there. That makes Australia in modern terms such a paradox, because it is a very modern society. But in terms of its attitude towards the one thing that's unique about Australia, and that is its indigenous people, is very primitive.
Can I ask you, how did you first become involved in Indigenous issues? Were you raised with an awareness of the injustice? Is it something you discovered as an adult? How did you first become aware of Indigenous issues in your home country?
No, I was brought up in ignorance. My generation, like generations that followed, I suppose the most benign view we had was that the indigenous people were dying off. They were a dying race. And oh, what a shame it was. That was the most liberal view. The illiberal view was to dismiss them as human beings. Mm. So I grew up in ignorance, and in fact I left Australia taking that ignorance with me when I went to Europe. And the irony for me was that I was sent back by the newspaper I was then working for in London to really discover my own country. And it was then that I went into the outback and Northern Territory around Alice Springs and saw something that I hadn't imagined. And it was soon after that that I began to make a series of films about indigenous people. So in many ways, those early films were registering my own shock, I suppose, and my own dismay and at finding people living and being so brutally treated within my own country.
We know what poverty does in these Indigenous communities. We see it here in New Zealand as well. Children dying from rheumatic fever, all of those preventable diseases. But what about poverty of spirit? How does that manifest itself in the communities that you work in?
Well, the poverty of Indigenous people is often quite similar across colonial societies. Because as the invasion of their societies happens and their own dispossession happens, then the fabric of their own society is often torn and damaged, and people turn to drink, and the cohesiveness of their own societies becomes a real issue. There's also what I would call an imposed poverty. In the traditional areas of Indigenous Australia, there are diseases such as trachoma. Australia is the only developed country that hasn't conquered trachoma, when even underdeveloped countries like Sri Lanka have got rid of it. And trachoma affects Indigenous children almost exclusively, and sends quite a few of them blind. Now, trachoma is a disease of poverty. It comes from overcrowding. It comes from dust. So, in other words, you go into some of the remote communities, and none of the roads are surfaced. The water supply is intermittent. All those modern facilities that would help to get rid of a very ancient disease like trachoma are just not there. Another disease of poverty is otitis media, and that is basically an ear infection that sends Indigenous kids deaf. I'll give you a good example. In the town of Roban in Western Australia, which is right in the middle of the mining boom over there, an estimated 70% of the children are deaf or partially deaf. You can imagine the effect on their development. They can't hear teachers and so on. I mean, to have that situation in a country that has advanced medical services and advanced other services, all associated with a very rich society, is just disgraceful.
Mr. Pilger, I wanted to ask you, you have NITV over there now, National Indigenous Television. How much importance do you place on the ability of Aboriginal people to be able to document and report their issues on a national platform?
I think it's very important. I think Aboriginal people running their own lives is key to it. First of all, being consulted, being in charge, drawing on all of the facilities available in this country. But so I think self-determination is a critical part of Aboriginal people living at levels that the rest of the population take for granted, and that includes self-determination, includes, of course, media. Media is absolutely critical because in this country, the so-called mainstream media has long stereotyped Aboriginal people and dismissed them, and now and then you will have something that is a reasonable picture, but it's usually a very, what I would call at best, a sort of missionary picture of of life in Indigenous Australia. So NITV is very, very important. Of course, as I've told my friends at NITV, what is also a problem is what is also extremely important is that the people in NITV are not co-opted into the wider mainstream system, that they keep their independence. That's very, very important. Yeah. And that has happened, that co-option has happened in Aboriginal organisations run by Aboriginal people, that they've become almost extensions of white society rather than an expression of Aboriginal society.
Do you think that's already started to happen? I know that they've come under SBS now. Do you think that sort of incrementally they're going to be more and more absorbed into mainstream media?
No, I don't think necessarily. SBS has done a pretty good job with the association with NITV. NITV have got good facilities. SBS put to air my film, Utopia. There is a general sense of wanting to do the right thing and wanting to make up for all the lost media ground as far as Aboriginal people are concerned. But you're quite right to raise it. I mean, these are corporations. And corporations haven't got a very good track record with Indigenous people. They tend to absorb and control rather than to let Indigenous people, it's not just letting Indigenous voices out. There are plenty of Indigenous voices, but it's which voices? And the dissenting voices are the most important, as they are in the majority society, as they are in any society, especially these days. There's no way of measuring any kind of progress unless those dissenting voices are let out. And that's very, very true of Indigenous, of the Indigenous situation here, because the dissenting voices have not been heard here. My film has them. Now, most of those people in Utopia are not known in the wider Australia. They're not known because they don't appear on the media. And that's a challenge for NITV, certainly, that to keep that, it's really keeping its independence to ensure that those dissenting voices are heard.
5-6 years on from the intervention, or the invasion, obviously it was a failure, as most Indigenous people
it wasn't a failure in terms of what it set out to do. It set out to actually smear Aboriginal people. It set out to it was based on a whole tissue of lies, and it did. A lot of the mud stuck. You know, you still find articles coming up in the Australian press about all the widespread child abuse and across Aboriginal societies, as if it exists only in Aboriginal societies. So it was a very cynical, deeply cynical operation, which was mounted by the John Howard government, in my view, with the aim of electoral advantage, because whenever in Australia, politicians, whenever they want to appeal to the lowest common denominator just before an election, they either beat up Aborigines or they beat up refugees. I'm afraid that's put crudely, but that's exactly what happens. So, unfortunately, it wasn't an entire failure from those who designed it. But as far as its impact on Aboriginal life, it was an absolute disaster. even the government's own review committee, 1 year after the intervention was mounted, found, and the word they used was a widespread despair among indigenous people. They found that self-harm and attempted suicide had quadrupled. There was malnutrition. So this was the direct effects of this assault on Aboriginal communities, of taking away from them the last vestiges almost of their independence, down to even the equipment that was used to improve their communities, to build roads and so on. All that was taken away, and instead they were controlled by at first by the military and then by the police. So it was a very disgraceful chapter in this country's history.
It was, and it's something that you document in the film.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, though, what are 3 things, perhaps, that John Howard could have done that might have actually made a difference to the quality of life of those communities?
Well, it's such a fantasy to think that John Howard would have done anything positive that it's very hard for me to even
entertain the idea.
Think about that. But, what the Australian political elite has to do, first of all, is to sit down with Aboriginal people and agree a treaty that is a Bill of Rights, a Bill of Health Rights, of education rights, of land rights, of resources rights, that these are not crumbs that fall off the table, but they are agreed between the original owners of this country and those who came later. And it's only when you have a system like that in place that Aboriginal people will feel secure. Here we have in the budget that Prime Minister Tony Abbott brought in earlier this year a cut of $534 million from the Indigenous budget. That includes a cut of $165 million from the health budget. So, he's the heir to Mr. Howard. I think that's your answer.
Mr. Pilger, before
have we got much longer?
No, I
do you
just
think?
wanted to ask you one question quickly before I go. Any plans to return to Gaza in the near future?
To Gaza?
Yes.
Yes. That's a good question. No, I don't have plans to return to Gaza, but I am writing about Gaza, and I am writing about Palestine. In fact, one of the reasons I've come back to Australia is to give the Edward Said lecture at Adelaide University on the 11th of September, and that is almost entirely about Gaza, and it will be published online, and it's about Palestine and why these terrible events have happened there. Until, they're related. The indigenous deprivation and privations and what has happened to the Palestinian people. They are the indigenous people of Palestine, and the attitudes towards them, the assaults on them, are not dissimilar in principle from those that the indigenous people in this country suffer from. In fact, the Australian Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, went over to Israel in the middle of the assault on Gaza, virtually to congratulate the Israeli government for doing the horrific things it was doing, and he described Australia and Israel as sister countries. Well, in their treatment of indigenous people, yeah, They're sort of sister countries, at least the elites are, but that should be a matter of shame. He was presenting it as some kind of perverse pride. So until there's justice for the Palestinian people, there won't be peace anywhere in the Middle East. That is the center. That is the hypercenter of the difficulties in the Middle East. And until there's justice for indigenous people in Australia, there won't actually be a kind of sense of true peace that is independence, a sense of national self in this country, until that happens, in my view.